Hi, I'm Jonathan Thomas. I chose to read Quaker Executions in Myth and History by Carla Pestana, mainly because my one ancestor was a Quaker, so I thought it'd be interesting to learn more about Quaker history. My ancestor, Dr. Thomas Wynne, was William Penn's personal doctor and friend who helped to establish Philadelphia. He was a surveyor, farmer, judge, and the first speaker of the Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly. In 1677, he wrote The Antiquity of the Quakers, and in 1679, he wrote An Anti-Christian Conspiracy. I didn't find that he mentioned anything specifically about the executions in Boston, but he did note religious persecution against Quakers in England, since he was himself imprisoned there preaching Quaker doctrines. The executions occurred from 1659 through 1661, where 4 Quakers were hung by the Puritans in New England for heresy. Mary Dyer, as the only woman concerned or executed, is the most famous. Today, we have an image of hypocritical Puritans in persecuting peaceful Quakers. Yet, as Pestana explained, this is mainly myth transformed throughout history. Both Quaker and Puritan historical interpretations adjusted over time. So Pestana illustrates why it is important not just to study the events in question, but also the history written about those events over time. Early Quakers emphasized aggressive prophetic missions to warn about the end of the world and highlight the necessity of receiving the inner light of God within themselves. Later Quakers, however, became pacifists and quietists and emphasized the martyrdom for their religious faith element. If we are looking for equivalents today, we might think of the early Quakers as more aggressive Jehovah's Witnesses, and later Quakers as even more passive Amish. Early Quakers were thus focused on converting Puritans to Quaker theology. Whether they were persecuted or not, it did not so much matter. Mary Dyer, for example, was set to be hung in 1659, but was pardoned and banished instead. Yet, she returned in 1660 to preach more and was then hung. Early Quakers were not so much interested in the cause of religious freedom. They were interested in converting Puritans to Quakers. Later Quakers, though, were more focused on gaining religious freedom without persecution. Pestana notes how later Quakers altered their early history by de-emphasizing the prophetic and instead emphasizing the martyrdom element. She described it in this way. In rewriting the history of the Quaker executions over the half-century after the Restoration, the Society of Friends, as the Quakers later became known, provided itself with a mythic past appropriate to its current concerns. Thus, the later Quakers could be found guilty of changing their history to fit their current ideals. However, it might also be said that the alleged need to change their early history actually served to impact their current ideals of pacifism and quietism. Early Puritans, on the other hand, emphasized the religious threat posed by the Quaker heresy and the need for intolerance in maintaining their religious and orderly society. Intolerance was not seen as wrong as many see it today, since it simply meant that they were standing up for what they knew to be true. But the executions were stopped for 2 reasons. First, they thought that the British king might not be too happy with them executing his citizens, and Charles II eventually did order them to stop, and their ineffectiveness in deterring Quaker missionaries. Later generations of Puritans, however, emphasized the Quakers breaking their civil law, and that religious freedom was always important to them. For instance, one of the more well-known third-generation Puritan writers, Cotton Mather, who depicted Quakers as grievous wolves, emphasized more tolerance. He wrote, "I feared that the zeal of my country had formerly had in it more fire than should have been, especially when the mad Quakers were sent unto the gallows." Instead of hangings, he thought that the suppression of heresy would be more effective by endeavors more spiritual and evangelical. Early Puritans emphasized that they were given religious freedom to practice their faith in America, but not others, and thus they could be as intolerant as they wished. They really didn't believe in religious freedom as a cause per se, only their righteous cause in establishing their current correct Christian orthodoxy, which just so happened to include a charter granted to them by the king with their freedom to do so. They also defended the banishment and killing of Quakers as the English banished and killed Jesuits. Later Puritans, on the other hand, emphasized that they always believed in religious freedom, since they feared that the king might revoke their charter and establish an Anglican church as the established religion in New England as it was in other colonies. Thus, the Quakers made note that if the Puritans believed in religious freedom, but denied that same freedom to others, they were indeed hypocrites. George Fox emphasized this hypocrisy of the Puritans. He wrote, "These stingy persecutors of New England were a people that fled thither out of Old England from the persecution of the bishops here. But when they had got power into their own hands, they so far exceeded the bishops in severity and cruelty." Whig and progressive historians came to highlight this version of history of Puritans as hypocrites. For example, they emphasized the tiny colony of pilgrims who truly left for religious freedom, rather than the intolerant Puritans of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Thus, we see both Quaker and Puritans changing their early histories to reflect their current values. But at the same time, as Pestana does not really emphasize, was that the effort to change their early histories possibly helped mold their current values as well.